What's up people, Craig Lopez here with another tutorialism, and today I'm going to be doing a beginner's guide to every single audio effect plugin in Cubase. Now of course that's a lot to go through in one sitting, so I'll put chapters in the description below, but everybody knows how YouTube works by now, so let's get into this. So Cubase 11 Pro comes with 6 EQ plugins and 5 filter plugins. So we're going to start off with Studio EQ. Let me turn the spectrum on and play some piano into it. And let's pause the screen and do a quick explanation as to what an EQ is. So in the center of the plugin, we have our spectrum analyzer. And this line is showing us the frequency response of that piano. The graph is measured in loudness from top to bottom and frequency from left to right, with the lowest frequencies being on the left. And what an EQ does is allow us to target specific frequencies and boost them or cut them. Studio EQ is a 4-band equalizer. Each of these bands works in pretty much the same way. We can choose a frequency using the first dial, boost or cut using the third dial, and the second band, the Q, determines how wide that cut or boost is. So let's have a listen. We have the DJ EQ, which is a more simplified 3-band EQ. We just have low, mid and high. We can boost or cut just by clicking and dragging. And we can do a low cut, high cut, and a mid-range cut. We have the GEQ10, which is a 10-band graphic equalizer, so we can't adjust the frequency or the Q factor of each band, but we can boost and cut in the same way. And we have the GEQ30, which works in the same way as the GEQ10, except this is a 30-band equalizer. We have the curve EQ, which allows you to boost and cut by drawing in curves. Now, curve EQ also has a spectrum matching technology, which allows you to transfer the spectral shape of one recording and apply it to another. And finally, we have frequency, which is Cubase Pro's flagship EQ, so comes with all the bells and whistles, loads of filter shapes. It's got dynamic EQ, linear phase, all that kind of thing. So next up we have filters, and what filters do is they filter out certain frequencies and they somewhat boost them if you want them to as well. So first up we have a dual filter, which is a combined low cut and high cut filter. So 2 controls, we have position and resonance. If we have the position in the negative numbers, we have a low pass stroke high cut filter. And if we have the position in the positive numbers, we get a high pass filter. And resonance will give us a boost at the point where the cut is taking place. Next up we have a morph filter, which allows us to morph between 2 different filters. We have filter A along the bottom and filter B along the top. So in this instance, I have filter B as a high pass and filter A as a low pass. We can set the frequency using this dial here and the resonance using this dial here. And we can morph between the 2 using this slider here. Next up, we have a wah-wah, which acts like a guitarist's wah-wah pedal, and that it opens and closes up the filter. We can do that by using this dial here. Next up, we have the step filter, which can automate the cutoff position and the resonant position using this step sequencer here. So along this graph, we have time, and from top to bottom, We have the position of the dials, with the lowest position of the grid being the lowest point of the dial and the highest point of the grid being the highest point of the dial. So let's have a listen to that. And finally, we have Tone Booster, which allows you to raise the gain in your selected frequency range. Okay, so next up we have dynamic plugins. Basically, dynamic plugins give us control over the overall volume of something. So let's start off with the compressor. So compression is probably the most basic to understand yet difficult to master thing in the whole of audio, I would say. So I've got this vocal here. I'm waiting for your love. And you can hear and see that the vocal starts off quiet and then gets louder. So first up we have a threshold amount. So let's say we set our threshold here. And that's just telling the compressor that anything that goes over the threshold amount is what we want to compress. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, we set our threshold at 10 dB. And let's say the loudest point of our audio is at 20 dB. If we set our ratio amount to be 2:1, that would just mean anything that comes in above 10 dB would be reduced by half. So instead of this highest level being 20 dB, it would be 15 dB. If we set it to 10:1, the highest level that this would get to would be 11 dB. Apologies for my bad handwriting. So let's have a listen to that in action. I'm going to go quite extreme with it so we can hear. So if I set the ratio to about 4:1 and pull the threshold right down, that means that anything that comes in above minus 25 dB will be reduced at a rate of 4:1. We can see how much gain reduction we're getting by looking at the gain reduction meter right here. I'm waiting for your love. Now, of course, we're reducing the overall volume, and we can make up for that by pulling up the makeup gain. I'm waiting for your love. And now we can hear that the difference between the first part of the vocal and the second part is not so extreme in dynamic range. So without, I'm waiting for your love. With, I'm waiting for your love. Let me just loop that around one more time so you can hear. I turn it on and off using this button here. So we start off without, and I'll turn it on. I'm waiting for your love. I'm waiting for your love. We've got control over attack. So how long after the compressor's hit does the compressor kick in? How long does it hold for? We've got release, which is how fast the compressor releases the audio signal. We can determine whether the compressor is working at a peak level or an RMS level. Not get into that right now. And we have a dry-wet mix. This is a digital compressor. Cubase also comes with two other compressors, which are kind of based on hardware compressors. We have a tube compressor, which also gives us a character dial, and the driver mount, which just adds some distortion, saturation, gives it a nice warm feel. And a vintage compressor, which is kind of based on an old 1176 compressor. Both the vintage compressor and the tube compressor kind of bundle threshold into just the input signal. So the harder you drive it, the more compression you will get. I'm waiting for your love. I'm waiting for your love. Next up we have the limiter, and what a limiter is a compressor with an infinite ratio. So that means nothing can get over the output level that you set. So if I set the output to minus 10, it doesn't matter how hard I drive the input, nothing above minus 10 will come out of the limiter. I'm waiting for your love. I'm waiting for your love. We also have a brick wall limiter, which works in the same way as a regular limiter, only it's got a faster attack time. Next up, we have a maximizer, and what a maximizer does is it raises the level of incoming material without the risk of clipping the output. We have two different algorithms, modern and classic, and to use it, you just basically pull this dial up.
I'm waiting for your love.
So next up, we have the expander. Now, with a compressor, you set the threshold level, and anything above the threshold is what's going to be compressed. With an expander, you set a threshold level, and anything underneath that threshold is going to be pushed up. So next up, we have gate, and when a gate is open, it lets sound through, and when a gate is closed, no sound can come through, and we set the level as to where we want the gate to open and close using the threshold amount, and we've got the usual attack, hold, and release options. So if I set the threshold to about here, the gate will be closed over the quiet part of this vocal and will open up when she says love. So we have MIDI gate. So again, it's another gate that opens and closes to let audio through. Only this time is triggered by MIDI as opposed to a threshold level. So I have a MIDI channel here, and that is routed to my MIDI gate. So if I press a key on my keyboard, the gate will open, and if I close it, the gate will close. So I'm going to press my keyboard on and off so you can hear it. We have VST Dynamics, which is basically a channel strip in that it combines a gate, compressor, and a limiter all in one plugin. And the VST Dynamics is kind of similar to the actual channel strip, which comes on every channel, and that we have a gate, compressor, and a limiter. In the channel strip, we also have some extra tools like a de-esser, envelope shaper, and some saturation. So let's have a look at the de-esser, and the de-esser does what it sounds like it does. It de-esses S's. So let's bring up a vocal with some harsh S's. So this is without the de-esser.
Just a touch.
So by default, it's just reducing the frequencies in this area here, which is generally where the S's are, but we can move that about using the high and low filters. Reduce or reduct is how much it is reducing by.
Just a touch. Just a touch.
And we also have automatic threshold level and a release amount. Now, with there being so many plugins included in Cubase, it was inevitable that I would forget to record some, so I'm doing this the day after, so you'll have to excuse the fact that I haven't set up my camera to re-record this. So first up, we have the envelope shaper, and what an envelope shaper does is allow you to enhance either the transient or the decay of each sound. So the transient is the initial hit, and the decay is the rest of the sound. So I've got this drum beat here. And if I turn on envelope shaper and increase the attack amount, you'll be able to hear that the initial transient on the drum hits will be enhanced. And with length and release, I'll be able to enhance the decay of the drum hits. And we also have some multi-band plugins in the dynamics section. And what a multi-band plugin does is split the signal into different frequency bands. So with the multi-band compressor, we have 4 bands here. So if I just solo the bands on their own, you'll be able to hear what that means. And with the multi-band compressor, we can then compress each frequency band independently. We also have a multi-band envelope shaper and a multi-band expander. And I can't believe I forgot to include this because I use it all the time, but we have Squasher, which is also a multi-band compressor, but it's not just a downwards compressor, it's also an upwards compressor. Now this thing is insane and really deserves its own tutorial, but let me just run through some of the presets on this drum track. Okay, so next up we have reverb. So let me just do a quick and dirty explanation as to what a reverb is. So imagine this is a room and this is you standing in it and this is me and I am talking in your ear. Now, obviously, you're going to hear the sound of my voice almost immediately. And a few milliseconds after that, maybe even less than milliseconds, you're going to hear the sound of my voice as it's hit these walls, bounced off them, and come back and hit you in the ear. So the sound of you hearing my voice and that slightly delayed bounced voice off the wall is what reverb is. So the most simple reverb we have is RoomWorks SE, only a few controls on this. Reverb time, which is how long the reverb tail is. Next up, we have pre-delay, which determines how long after hearing the sound does the reverb start to work. We have diffusion, which determines the character of the reverb. So higher values makes the reverb sound smoother, lower values makes it sound a bit more clear. Finally, we have low level and high level, which are low pass and high pass filters, which are placed on the sound before they enter into the reverb. So next up, we have the full version of RoomWorks, which just gives us slightly more options than RoomWorks SE. So we can change the size of the room, we can change the stereo width, and there's a few extra controls in here. But of course, this isn't a video on just how reverb works, so I don't want to get stuck down explaining any one plugin for too long. But my advice is just to load up any plugin and play about with it and just have a look through some of the presets. And next up we have Revelation, which is a slightly more advanced algorithmic reverb. So I'm going to use this one on a snare. So without the reverb, the snare sounds like this. And with. So we have similar controls that we do with RoomWorks along the bottom and the top. One cool thing about Revelation is we can blend between the early reflections and the reverb tail. The early reflections sound like this. The reverb tail sounds like this. And we can blend between them. We've also got some control over the modulation on the reverb, but we'll get onto modulation in just a little bit. So finally we have Reverence, which is an impulse response reverb. So where Revelation is an algorithmic reverb, as in it just works off loads of zeros and ones that somebody's programmed into it, Reverence actually reads samples. So in the case of this preset here, someone would have went to this LA studio with a microphone, and I think maybe they clap their hands at one end of the studio and record it at the other end of the studio, and then they go around loads of different places like churches, wherever, do the exact same thing, and then they feed all of those samples into this reverb. The reverb does some witchcraft, and we get an exact replication of the reverb in that particular space. And what that winds up being is a lot more cleaner, realistic style sound of reverb, but we have less options to manipulate it than we do with an algorithmic before it starts to sound unnatural. So without the reverb, and with. Let's have a listen to some of the presets. Very cool. So next up we have delays, and what delays basically do is they record the incoming signal, then they wait a little bit of time or delay a little bit of time that we determine before they spit the sound back out again. So first up we have a mono delay. So in the middle here we have the amount of time before the delay spits the sound back out again. So I'm just going to play the snare again. And with this set to eighth notes, it'll sound like this. With 16ths. We have a low filter and a high filter. Feedback amount determines how many delays we hear. And then of course we have our dry wet mix. Now stereo delay gives us the same controls as mono delay, only this time we have two delays, and we can send either delay to either the left or right or anywhere in between independently of each other. So if I set the left delay to 1/8 notes and the right delay to 1/2 notes, we will get something like this. Next up, we have a ping pong delay. Again, similar controls, but this time instead of the delay coming back like it's going to bounce between left and right speakers. So we're going to get this. We have multi-tap delay, which allows us to modulate the delays and do all kinds of crazy things. This thing is a tutorial all in itself, but let me just load up some presets so you can hear what it sounds like. Mod Machine, also a similar thing in that it's a delay with added modulation controls. Let's load up some presets on this too. We also have Loop Mash, which I could probably do a whole video just on Loop Mash. It basically records bits of the audio and loops it around in different ways depending on which of these buttons you press, and all these buttons can be triggered via MIDI. So let me just play the drum beat on its own. And then watch and listen what happens when I start to press some of these buttons. So next up we have modulation effects. And modulation just basically means move around. So modulation effects will either move the sound from left to right, or they'll move the pitch up and down, or move the timing forwards and backwards, that kind of thing. So first up we have auto pan, and what auto pan will do is move the sound from left to right according to this LFO curve here. So if you've got headphones on or you're close to your speakers, you're going to be able to hear this. If not, you won't. We can determine the speed here, the width. We have phase, which is basically the starting point. We can also have this move in time to our project by clicking on the sync button. And with the sync button enabled, then the factor comes into play. So right now we've got it at ×1 on quarter note. If we have it on ×2 on a quarter note, it will basically be 1/2 ×4. Basically would be every 1 note, and so on and so forth. So next up we have tremolo, and tremolo just basically modulates the amplitude of a sound. So we can determine the speed of that happening using this dial. Got the depth. Spacial, which basically adds a stereo effect to the modulation. And then we have output. So next up we have vibrato, which basically modulates the pitch of a sound. Again, we have a depth amount, a rate amount, and a spatial amount. And we can sync it or have it free running. We have chopper, which is a tremolo effect, except we have control over the shape of the modulation with this LFO thing in the middle. Again, we have a depth amount, speed amount, and here we can control whether we want the stereo to be modulating between the left and right, or whether we want it to be the same in both speakers. Next up we have chorus, and what chorus basically does is it doubles up the audio signal, but with the double signal it slightly detunes it a little bit. It sounds like this. We have delay, which affects the frequency range of the modulation sweep by adjusting the initial delay. We have a width amount for stereo width, spatial, mix, high pass, low pass filter, and we have a rate amount, which can be synced or free running. Next up, we have the studio chorus, which is basically the same thing times 2, and that is 2 choruses. Let's load up some of the presets and have a listen to see what that sounds like. Next up, we have the flanger, and what a flanger does is similar to the chorus in that it duplicates the signal, only with the second signal, instead of it being pitched up and down like it is with the chorus, it moves slightly forward and backwards in time, and we get this kind of effect. We have a delay amount, feedback, which can get crazy, rate amount. We have high range and low range, which is going to affect which part of the signal is being affected. And we have a low and high filter, so we can filter out any frequencies that we don't want. Next up, we have the phaser. And what a phaser does is, again, it basically duplicates the audio signal. But with the duplicated signal, it basically adds some EQ, peaks and curves, and then modulates where those peaks and curves are and plays that alongside the original audio. And that sounds like this. So it's an effect you've heard before. Again, we have similar controls, feedback with spatial, mix, high-low filter, and a rate amount. Let's have a listen to some of the presets. So next up, we have rotary, and what that does is it emulates a rotary speaker, which is just a speaker that rotates around and round. That sounds like this. We can control the speed amount using this dial. So we have control over the shape of the speaker. So we have the horn and the bass part of the speaker. We have where the virtual mics are picking up the speaker. We've got control over overdrive, which will give us some distortion. And we have a crossover amount, which determines where the horn and the bass crossover. Next up, we have ring modulator, and what ring modulation does is it creates these kind of bell-like complex sounds. So that sounds like this. I'm going to load up a few presets because, like a lot of the things in this video, ring modulation probably deserves a video all to itself. Next up, we have metalizer. Metalizer feeds the signal through a variable frequency filter, which you can see here. Let's have a listen to that. Got feedback amount. Sharpness. And tone. As well as whether we want the signal in mono, and we have an output control as well. Next up, we have cloner, and I absolutely love cloner. What that does is it duplicates the signal and it puts a delay and detunes the signal and can do that up to 4 times. So let's have a listen to that on a vocal. So this is the vocal without cloner on.
I'm waiting for your love.
And this is it with one voice cloned.
I'm waiting for your love.
With 2.
I'm waiting for your love.
3.
I'm waiting for your love.
And 4.
I'm waiting for your love.
On each of the voices, we can determine how much each is detuned, whether detuned up or down, and what the delay amount is. We also have global control over all of these with the controls at the bottom. Let me just load up some presets so you can hear the kind of thing it can do.
I'm waiting for your love. I'm waiting for your love.
Next up, we have transformer, and what this is another ring modulator. that modulates the incoming signal by an internal variable frequency oscillator, producing new harmonics. Sounds like this. I'll do it on the vocal again.
I'm waiting for your love.
Let's have a listen to some of the presets. Very cool if you want to get experimental. So we have two pitch correction tools in Cubase. The first one is pitch correct. Sounds like this.
I'm waiting for your love.
Right now it's sounding quite natural and the singer is singing in tune. But if I pull up the correction amount, we get that robotic T-Pain kind of sound.
I'm waiting for your love.
Tolerance is kind of the amount of the effect you want. We can also transpose everything. So let's say I want this vocal down by an octave.
I'm waiting for your love.
We can also play in the notes that we want using external or code track, or we can change what key we want this to be in.
I'm waiting for your love.
Very cool. We have the octaver, which duplicates a signal and spits it out once, one octave below, and the second time, another octave below that. We have control over the levels of the two octaves using these two dials here.
For your love. I'm waiting for your love.
This is really handy if you want to beef up a bass line or a kick drum, something like that. Next up, we have distortion plugins. I always find these difficult to explain properly. Obviously, everybody knows what distortion sounds like, but to put it into words, I always find quite difficult. But anyway, according to Wikipedia, with respect to audio, distortion refers to any kind of deformation of an output waveform compared to its input. So I've just got this guitar loop here. So first up, we have oversampling. Now, if you ever see an oversampling button in a distortion plugin, always turn it on. It will just give you a better quality sound and distortion, all to do with mathematics, which I'm not going to explain because I don't fully understand it. It is more CPU intensive. So if you've got a computer that can handle it, always put oversampling on. I'm going to pull the output down and I'm going to pull the mix up and let's see what we have. We've got a boost dial. Feedback amount. Tone. And Spacial, which will obviously give us a bit of a stereo field. And this can be quite nice if we pull down the dry wet mix and blend in the distortion with the original signal. We have Destroyer, which adds harmonic content. It can be used either subtly or we can turn up the boost and the drive to get something more extreme. Or anywhere in between. We have Detube, which emulates a tube amplifier. We just have a dry wet mix dial, a drive amount, and an output amount. Sounds like this. So a lot more subtle, but it can be nice to add a bit of warmth to a very cold and harsh sound. We have Magneto, which emulates tape saturation. If we click on this solo button, we can hear just what the effect is doing without hearing the original signal. Very cool. I love Magneto. Sounds good on almost everything. We have Soft Clipper, which kind of confused me at first because it doesn't actually clip. It just emulates the sound of something that is clipping in the analog world using second and third order harmonics. Again, this is a whole other subject that if you want to, you can go look up for yourself. But if not, just play about with these two dials and have a listen to what it does to the sound. very subtle. But again, just adding a nice little bit of warmth. We have the bit crusher, which reduces the bit rate, which is the fidelity of the digital signal. Make everything sound like an old computer game. Sounds like this. We have Grungelizer, which when I turn it on, adds noise, crackle, static, similar to what you would get with a needle on a record player. We have Amp Simulator, which simulates various guitar amps. Let's go through some of the presets. We have Quadrophers, which again, I absolutely love this thing. It splits the audio into 4 frequency bands and lets you put a different type of distortion on each one of those bands. So let me just solo each band. So band 1, band 2, band 3, band 4. As you can see, we can add tape distortion, tube distortion, distortion, amp distortion to each one of those separate bands individually. And we have individual controls over the width, mix, pan of each band. So much you can do with this. Let's have a listen to some of the presets. And as you can hear, we've also got a delay for each band as well. Next up, we have Amp Rack, which is a virtual guitar chain plugin. So we have pre-effects. So these are like guitar pedals, different kinds of amplifiers, different types of cabinets, effects that you can put on after you come out of the cabinet, different types of microphones you can pick up the cabinet with, all kinds of things. Let's have a listen to some of the presets. There's also a bass amp, which does the same thing, but it's more geared towards basses. Now, what I would say is don't just use these amplifiers on guitars. Use them on anything, synthesizers, drums, vocals, anything. Okay, so we're nearly there. I think we've only got one category left to go, which is spatial panel plugins. So first up, we have mono to stereo, and what this will do is add a bit of stereo dimension to a mono signal. So I've got a mono synth here. Add mono to stereo. Let's turn it all the way up. Color, we'll add a little bit of saturation. So many things you can use that on. Love it. We also have stereo enhancer, which works in a similar way in that it widens the signal. Only this used on a stereo signal rather than a mono signal. And you can also turn a stereo signal mono using the dial in the middle. Let's have a listen to that. We've also got controls over color and delay. We have Imager, which is one of the new plugins to come with Cubase 11, I believe. And this splits the audio into 4 frequency bands and gives us control over the stereo width of each of those bands. So what I could do is make the low frequencies mono and the higher frequencies wider. Or I could pan band 2 to the left and band 3 to the right. That's making me feel a bit weird. But yeah, loads of things we can do with this. If you put it over a whole drum mix, you can just make the top end of your drums nice and wide while having your kick centered, that kind of thing. Now we also have a couple of other plugins under here. We have this Mix Convert and this Multi VST Panner. Now these are for anyone working in surround sound with more than 2 speakers. I've never done that, so I've never really used these plugins. but they're there if you need them. And finally, we also have this ambi converter and ambi decoder. Now, this is, again, a massive topic all into itself, but basically with ambi decoder, you can create these weird 3D spatial kind of effects when you listen on headphones. Again, not something I've ever really done, so I don't know too much about, but if you want me to dig into it and play about with it and make a video, let me know in the comments. No, I almost forgot. Under mastering, we have the UV22HR, which adds a little bit of dithering. Now, dithering is a topic way beyond my pay grade, but it adds a little something when you convert your project into a .wav file or into a .mp3 file to make it play nicely. I tend to use the internal dithering that comes within Cubase, but if you are an expert in dithering and you want to use the Apogee UV22 to get a different kind of dithering, it's there. We also have some options for network, and these plugins are for when you're recording someone online. I would love to do a video on all of this, but I live in a really bad apartment with really bad internet, so recording people online is a little bit beyond my reach right now. Okay, so that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Thanks for supporting. If you want to support the channel further, I'll put some details in the description below. But anyway, that's it for now. I've been Craig Lopez. This has been Tutorialism. Peace.